and welcome back to Dollars and Dragons. Today I have with me Devon Chulick. If you'd like to introduce yourself to our audience.
Hi, my name is Devon. I'm one of the co-founders of StartPlaying and one of the creators of Total Party Chill. Really happy to be here.
Wow, I like how you looked at the camera, even though this is an audio only. Like you're just so media
I know.
trained that.
It's also I'm using a shotgun mic, and so I
Oh,
like
okay.
it's right above the camera. So I was like, I want trying to be audio trained too.
Yeah. How do you like shotgun mics? I haven't used one before. I've just been using this Rode.
So I have this other old one, but the interface got a little messed up, and then I started using my Rode shotgun mic, and it sounded pretty good.
Right.
And I there's a lot of like audio effects that I use when editing, so I was able to get like all the audio fixes I needed, and it still sounded just as good as like a condenser mic.
Oh, cool. Yeah. Is that directional or no? The shotgun.
Yeah,
Yeah, that's that kind of that weird effect. I think like when I would have to get used to it, I think like I would have to like get used to like looking directly at it as opposed to like right now, audio is not as good with the condenser, but I don't have to look directly at the mic.
right.
Yeah. Okay, let's talk about Total Party Chill. What is it and how did you get started and what's the story on that?
Yeah, so Total Party Chill is a tabletop RPG studio for merch, actual plays, a bunch of stuff here in San Francisco. And it's actually what led towards the creation of Start Playing, if you can believe it. Me and my friends, we've been playing, D&D a ton, and we invited a friend to come play at our game. Like, you have friends come and they're like the guest star of the game when they want to learn to play. And my friend Nick Catania, he worked at Twitch, and he was a huge like Dungeons and Dragons guy. And after the game, he's like, "Hey, have you ever thought about like streaming your content? Because that was one of the best games I've ever played in my life. And I watch tons of D&D content on Twitch, and this is better than most of what I watch." I was like, "Whoa, really?" And then I was like, "That's cool." And then I went and started trying to figure out like how could we stream on Twitch, and like all the streaming was mostly people in the same like they're all at their own homes, kind of remote streaming. And I was like, how would I do it in person? And there was nothing out there. I actually ended up making a tutorial because there was nothing about there like how to stream like Critical Role or like in the same studio. And then I was like, wow, it's actually be kind of expensive. And that's what kind of led towards an opportunity coming across where I've been running games for just tons of people just to introduce them to the game because I loved it. And someone was like, hey, would you run a game for my coworkers? They would love this. And in my head, I'm like, I don't know your coworkers. That doesn't sound like fun to me. And then they said, our budget for things like that's like about $500. And I was like, wow, that's crazy. That's exactly what I charge.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I was like, if I do this, then I could probably earn enough to build out what I need for a studio. And yeah, so that's me starting to pro GM was on the back of that. It was money I can make moonlighting, and I could put towards a tabletop RPG studio.
Yeah, that's one of those things where I'm thinking about it, and I've run some of the corporate games that Start Playing has put together every once in a while for the more experienced GMs on the platform.
Yeah.
Is this a secret? Can I talk about this?
Yeah, no, by all means.
Okay. So once you're a more experienced GM, you might get invited by and you just have a good record, essentially. Like you have good reviews and stuff, and like that's what I inferred from it anyway, because I was looking at some of the other GMs who were in there. And anyway, so the corporate experience has really been they're remote for now, but I know that you used to have the option for a while for like in person, and those are just more difficult to set up, I think. Or there's less demand. I don't know what the deal is there, but
yeah, there's less demand. There's still a few we do. A lot are in the Bay Area, a little bit in New York, and we had one was like 8 GMs in Atlanta, which was really cool. There was like the whole company offsite, like we need like 8 game masters. It's like whoa, and every table had like 6 or 7 people.
that's cool.
But those are definitely a la carte. When we start like servicing in person gaming really well, it's gonna be a lot easier to do in person like corporate games really well too.
Yeah, I think the corporate experiences that I had were pretty good. But you could obviously tell like it's mandatory fun. So like some
Yeah,
people just ain't into it. So it's like
yeah.
it's one of those things. I would say overall, probably the easiest games I've ever run because it's like a lot of the time these people are new. You're teaching them, they're playing for the first time. Maybe they've seen D&D or Stranger Things or something like that, and that's like the extent of it. So yeah, I think corporate events are pretty cool. But shifting back to Total Party Chill, I see that like in my first impression of like what made or what makes your show pretty unique and like special is the chemistry between your people there, which I think is a benefit, obviously, of having them all be friends and all that.
Yeah.
Can you speak to what it was like to wrangle that many people for
Yeah.
a streaming show?
It's crazy how long we had like an incredible how long we were able to create content together without having like scheduling problems. Like everyone just kind of made Sundays holy and we just recorded. And when we first started, we were in a temporary space. So essentially we would go there the day we were streaming and we could set up and then we'd have to break down. So every Sunday we'd drive all the equipment in, backdrops, computers, monitors, mics, and we'd film everything and then we'd break it down and we'd take it. But but everyone just got so much joy from it. And now that we've definitely expanded from like our original cast, and now we have like, like 30 something people that like, come and create content with us. There's something when you're doing in person and you have a studio space where like everyone comes and hangs out ahead of time, and there's a lot of time to build more chemistry and to get to know each other because of that. Because when like, okay, we're done and we finished recording, it's like, all right, well, we're all in the same place still. Like, let's go get a drink. When you're doing that remotely, it's like, all right, thank you so much, guys. I gotta jump off. I gotta, and so you sometimes miss those other moments. Or like I feel like I'm sounding like a CEO talking about like go back in office work, but these like these moments that you get because you're next to each other create like really good chemistry, and it's harder to do that, I think, when you're a remote crew. But the wrangling was actually quite easy. Everyone was like, yes, I want. And if someone couldn't make it, it's like, okay, like you just can't make it that week. No big. We'll figure something out. Yeah.
Yeah. CEOs call that office culture. By the way, office culture. We have to preserve the office culture.
Yeah, I know.
It's so cringe. But for you all, I think that makes total sense because I think one of the things that really the most I think successful shows of this format, of the actual play format, really lend to that in-person connection because you're so invested in playing with these other people. Everything automatically becomes more emotional, more deep, more meaningful. You've got people that can play on each other and understand each other's like jokes and chemistry better, and the body language really helps a lot. So there's so many benefits to it that I think that
it's a lot of energy.
Yeah, energy. That's a good word for it. Good vibes.
And it's funny too. Like there are so many people in tabletop that I would love to like play games with. Like, but it's I'm just not set up for remote gaming. And having the space, it's like I want to utilize as much as possible. So I end up like essentially meeting a lot of people that normally wouldn't find themselves in D&D games. Like our latest season of This Game is Cursed. We have two people who have never played before. But I knew they would be fantastic at the table. And so that was a lot of fun. We had Tay, and Tay, he works at PlayStation. He's like 7 feet tall. Used to be a basketball player, and he lived in Oakland his whole life. And he is just hilarious to have at the table. Same with Phil Mills, who was also part of that. They were the two people who had never played before that joined for that season. And I knew that they were good people. I knew that they were funny people. I knew they had good energy. And so I was like, because we can't work with so many people that are spread out because we don't do remote shows. I was like, this is perfect. And it did make for magic. That was one of my favorite games I ever got to run.
I think that's that really speaks to like the hidden skill that we're talking about. That's very both important in business and then also when you're dealing with any sort of like show or anything like that. It's like, I think you, Devon, understand how to recruit people, and I think you understand what it is to like work in that talent acquisition, like figuring out who has the right thing to create the chemistry that works for a thing, that works for a show. And that sort of vision is like, honestly, like some people just don't have that, even if they're good at other aspects of the actual play. Like, and that would fall under normally like a producer or like the casting
Yeah.
director or whatever it might be. But definitely, definitely underutilized as a production gets the first shit, I guess,
Yeah.
um, for most people. It's like, we'll just get out there and they'll love us, but like really like without a vision, without like that sort of direction or curation, it's going to be really difficult to create a good show.
Yeah.
For you building like that sort of chemistry at the table for a show's purpose, what would you say is the things that you look for?
I look for let's see. I look for enthusiasm. Is one thing. And just like natural humor. I knew way, depending on what the show is. But it's really funny. We filmed another season that we haven't released yet called Fog City, and it's Monster of the Week. And the crew I had filmed it with was like the first time we did like a big show together. But I called them the AP students because they were like the ones that every time there was a one shot, they would come with like, oh, I printed out the entire setting guide and I highlighted these notes that I think are relevant to me. Like everyone was so far and above. And it was very interesting because the joke is that my OG crew is the detention kids because they're the bad kids. But it's also like the shows that I would run with the bad kids are different than the shows with the AP students. So it's also like knowing like the right people and the right story really helps. And so I think it's a lot of like figuring out personalities and like what mixes well and who's just excited to be there.
And for you moving like through different platforms, and we have the death of Twitter like nigh. I don't know when that's going to happen, but like
we keep getting the final nail in the coffin until we find another nail,
Yeah, everybody's just like bleeding followers as like people abandon the website. But as for you and like moving through your strategy and like your growth and everything like that, what do you think has been the most valuable thing you've learned in the last year for producing content for you? Because I know that you have on your YouTube channel, which we'll have the links in the description for all the Total Party Chill stuff. You have a few different shows coming out. You have 10-minute tabletop news, and you have some other fun things that you're doing with the channel. Now that you've moved on to sort of utilizing YouTube, I was checking in on you. I think it was when you first started moving to YouTube and investing more effort into it. Was like last year, right? Yeah, it looks like last year. Yeah,
wow,
and
deep dive Friday.
No, I
love it. I'm so impressed.
I run a podcast, okay, Devon?
Yeah.
So I've seen that you've kind of varied your content, and I'm in a business like mastermind with another Devon Nash. It's spelled with an I though. Yeah, so I'm in his mastermind and have a ton of YouTubers in that coterie. So I learned a ton about YouTube. I don't utilize YouTube as much as I probably should. Maybe I will at some point. I'm still like, in the, like I post once every 6 months and I get a burst of energy and then I'm like, okay, I won't touch this for a while. But you have been consistent with like interesting new formats for shows. And I see you're getting more and more regular viewership and you're spreading to more. I think YouTube is super interesting to me. What's it been like for you as a YouTuber, like more focusing on creating this content?
So there's a few things, right? Like if you want to be a full-time content creator, then you have to. There's two routes. One is very high quality long form content, or very high output, not as high quality content. And that's kind of like how I looked at news. I was like, oh, I'm going to try something that catches that. And I also just felt like, there's so much deep dive in tabletop news that it felt like a niche that was being missed. And so we just took 3 weeks off for our break. But going back to it tomorrow. And I realized I listen to so much short form news. I listen to like 3 different podcasts that are all like 10 to 15 minutes each. That are like business, pop culture, or other, and I'm like, I feel like this was a niche that was missing, and I kind of made it for myself first. And it's funny when I look at all the things that have done really well for Total Party Chill and me, it's all the things that like I wanted to exist and things that I liked. So like This Game Is Cursed was like a story I've been wanting to tell forever. And I actually tried to tell it twice, but both groups, like people ended up moving away or something happened and which broke down and I had to like restart from the beginning. So I was like, no. But it was something I always wanted to do. And I think that does change its performance because you care so much more about it. But the thing I always recommend to people is it doesn't need to be perfect. Like, you just need to put out stuff. And you just make it better than it was the last time. Which is such a Mr. Beast quote, but it's really true. Like everything, you just try to make it better than it was last time. And this is like, we've now kind of hired an editor and we had, often if we're filming in the studio, we hire like a producer for the day to actually do camera switching and things like that. But it's things that we didn't used to do, but now like we have the means that we can do a little bit more. And so, I always recommend like, always try to make it better than what you did before.
Yeah. The difference in quality when you actually add someone that's a dedicated producer or dedicated editor is just night and day normally, because it slows down your workflow so much as a YouTuber. I'm friends with quite a few YouTubers, and a lot of what kills them is like their sort of paralysis with editing, in that making this video like absolutely just perfect when they could, if they find the right editor that can mimic their style or what they want, they could 2x or 4x like the videos that they push out, because they just need to shoot the content and then they send it together and they say, hey, this is kind of my vision for this. Can you make this happen? And it really just speeds up the workflow to be working with someone else.
So what I did when I hired my editor is I hired 3 editors to edit an episode. And I edited the first episode and I said like, hey, here's kind of like my low stakes skill with doing this. This is like the raw video. This is the edited one. So you can kind of see like what I'm hoping for. And then like how I use B-roll, how I use titles, and it's like, if you can make it better than I can, that's what I'm looking for. And then 3 people, they all sent back their own versions, and I was like, okay, I'm an obvious winner. And now like it's really cool. They're like, oh, I can't wait for the next episode. Dude, this is like they're very invested in it, and it could be the fact that like I'm paying them, but they're constantly saying like very kind things about the show, or what we're putting out. Like, oh, that was so cool, and I'm like, oh my gosh, this is great.
That's like that rare combination of someone who is really excited about your content and then also will produce better work because they are excited about your content and they understand like the core of it or like what makes it special. That's essentially what happens to a lot of these YouTube channels, from my understanding. After a certain point, once you get up to 100,000, 200,000, you normally have to start doing that if you've gotten up to that point, because otherwise the sort of drudgery of your need to produce more content in order to keep the ad money coming in or the sponsorships, it's going to weigh you down. And it's eventually like the more you can take production off your plate, the more creative stuff that you can just make and focus on the things that you prefer to do.
Caleb Bennett, who was the producer for This Game is Cursed, it changed the filming of it too, because for Fox City I produced live while recording, so it was pre-recorded, I believe. It was pre-recorded, and so I'm recording and I'm actually doing like the live sound mixing and the live camera switching while jamming, and so I have just like a switcher in front of me that I'm switching to the different cameras and overlays and things like that. And that pulls away from running the game, because you're thinking like, oh, I should highlight this person because they're doing a monologue, go there. But when I had Kayla, they were like just phenomenal, so cool, because they just had their monitor set up, they had the switcher in front of them, and they just switched between people, and it made for a great series.
Let's talk about as much as you can. So there's rumors, the rumor mills, the grapevine has told me that there is a video game based on the setting in Total Party Tell.
Yeah. So there is a very cool company, and I'll be tweeting more about it when we're allowed to say more. But I met them at GDC, which is the game developer conference that happens in San Francisco every year. And because there's this overlap with tabletop gaming and video games, that's really evident. And I met a bunch of people. I met like Fablecraft, which is like the first VTT and RPG in one. Like you can only play their RPG on their VTT, things like that. And I met this company, and essentially there's a handful of creators that they're kind of building out a beta with, and these are all imagine like someone who has a game system, right? And you're like, cool, we have this game system, we have a game engine, and we want to make a bunch of games with it. And I'm trying to think of an allegory or a metaphor of something else that's doing something similar to this. But imagine if Steam was a game engine instead of a marketplace, where it was just the game engine was just Steam, and then all those games on there were all running off of Steam, and they were all using that game engine. So a bunch of creators are creating content for it, writing story, and all of those will have kind of like their own adventures and games set that way. And so actually, my meeting with them is after our meeting, because I have like a check-in to like, okay, how's the outline coming? How's this coming? Which is cool. But it's a lot of work. It's a lot of writing, but it's very cool. And then classic GM thing, I get on a tangent, and then I end up writing more about something that like I isn't as relevant, and I'm like, damn, okay, I need to like cut a bunch of this and go back and like, because I got so excited, I started writing so much in on one piece of plot that isn't even relevant to the first chapter or things like that, because you meander when you're world building, you have a lot of fun with it.
Yeah, you need a go ahead.
The game is gonna be cool. It's multiplayer, so it's very there's a lot of like tabletop aspects to it that like it's meant to be played with other people.
Are you creating an outline and then turning that into a writing team at that studio, or are you the primary writer? Are you going to acquire a team?
So I'm the primary writer for my part of the project with this company, and they have an editor and a syntax writer. So the syntax writer helps a lot with because you have to rename a lot of things so that like engineering the actual system itself can be like, okay, this is a non-playable character. This refers to all playable characters. This refers to like if you talk about the weather, you need to have a weather syntax. It's like, okay, weather, which is environment, which is like one of 7 settings.
Right. Gotcha. Yeah, that's so like a developmental editor for tabletop. That makes sense. Very cool. I'm looking forward to hearing more about it. Was there any like any other nuggets that you could drop, or no?
There's a lot of really cool people that are in their beta that are creating stories for this engine. So I feel very stoked that I get to be in it. I don't think I can share because I don't know how much they have shared with their communities, but it feels kind of like I probably can't even say that. No, I can't. I wish. Oh my gosh.
Okay, gotcha. Yeah, I mean, I'm sure you're gonna announce it on Twitter and or Total Party Chill, YouTube and all that stuff, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
I can't wait to blow it up. I was like, can I start talking about this now and sharing screenshots? And they're like, no, not yet. I was like, all right. I think it's like after New York Comic Con. I can because that's when they announce their product.
Okay.
When it's a startup. Yeah. When is New York Comic Con? That is October 12th.
Okay. That'll probably be around the time that I release this episode, so I'll go back in and modify the notes and just link to your announcement if it's already happened. So cool. Let's talk about StartPlaying game origins, and then we'll get into what is the platform. I think a lot of our listeners do know about it. The other side would be those that listen that are from the tabletop designer side of my listeners. So let's talk about StartPlaying games.
So I love telling the founding story. I've told it so many times, but I still love it. I told earlier how I was like taking on pro GMing to kind of fund the Total Party Chill, the tabletop RPG studio. And when I was doing this, I was like, wow, I wonder how many more like people are looking for a pro GM. So I made a website and I just spent a weekend. And because of my experience as like in e-commerce, PM, just performance marketing, all that. It was really easy for me to get started. So I made a website, spent the weekend doing it, and within like a week or two, I had my first booking. And then a week or two later, I had another booking. And they just started rolling in. And it's because I had, really good SEO. Like I had very low friction on the experience, and I didn't put a lot of work into it, but I think someone who doesn't have that experience would have to put a lot more work into it. And so I started running these games, and it was great. And for a year or two, it just continued to grow. And then I got a phone call from Mary Pilon, who is a writer for Bloomberg Business Week. And she's like, "Hey, I'm doing a story on pro GMing. I'd love to interview." And I'm like, "Absolutely. You kidding me?" And after interviewing me, I got the feature, which was really, really cool. And that meant that like I got like the bulk of the story after she interviewed a bunch of GMs. And that's what put me on the map for a lot of other GMs. After the story broke, I was getting emails every week from other GMs like, "Hey, how can I do what you did?" I was like, "Oh gosh, okay, well, this, and this." And I was taking meetings, and then I was like, "Okay, I need to do something to like connect all these people." All the while this is happening, I had this one client who's actually now an investor of StartPlaying. And he once had hired me to drive up to Tahoe, which is like 3.5 hours from me. Maybe for an evening to run a game for him and his family. And he paid me like $1,200.
Yeah.
And I know, right? And I was like, wow, that's a long time. And then I'm probably have to stay up there. He's like, "Okay, I'll pay for the hotel." I was like, okay. Ran a great game for his kids and his family. And every time they came to visit California, I would run a game for them. And then he's like, "Hey, do you know any game masters in Chicago? Because that's where we live, and I want to get the kids like something like weekly." I was like, "I don't, but like that's a problem." So eventually I ended up creating a newsletter and Facebook group to like let all these GMs kind of share resources, advice. And I was like, I want to make like a directory listing so people can find GMs. I started working on one. I was like, God, I'm gonna have to hire a developer for this. I was like, maybe I'll save it for the next next time I get like a nice Christmas bonus. Maybe I'll hire a developer with that. And so I kind of let the idea just kind of sit because I just didn't have the time or the technical know-how. And it's very hard to ask your technical friends like, "Hey, I got this like kind of like little side project. Can you give me some time?" They're like, "God, everyone is looking for time for a weird side project when you have technical friends that are engineers." And so then I got a phone call from Nate, who's now my co-founder, for those that don't know Nate. And it was the first day of the pandemic. It was the first day of lockdown in San Francisco. And he asked if he could hire me. I was like, "Sure, yeah, absolutely." He's like, "Yeah, obviously, it has to be remote." But then he started asking me PM questions, and PM means product manager questions. And those are, usually like, "Hey, so like, what's the hardest part of being a pro GM? Where do you spend most of your time?" And I was like, "Hey, what are you building?" He's like, "What?" I was like, "These are all like product manager questions, product management questions. Like, what are you building?" He's like, "Oh, I don't know. I just had this idea." And if we go back, we talk about Nate's experience. Nate was the guy who always wanted to play, and he would listen to Taz. He would watch Critical Role. He loved it, and him and his friends all also loved it, but nobody wanted GM. So what they would do is every week, they would rotate who would be GMing, and that person would actually like end up bailing on it, not prepare. They kind of like half run a game, and then everyone would just end up playing a board game instead. And so he was like, "Man, like, why is it this hard to like find some GM?" And then he like looked around. He's like, "Oh, there's a lot of people that advertise this." All while this is going on, Nate is in Y Combinator, and he is building a product that he's not excited about. And then he's hearing that like there might be a lockdown for 3 to 6 weeks, and he's like, "That means I can't do any of the brick and mortar stuff I needed to do for the thing that he was building in Y Combinator." Which, if you're not familiar with Y Combinator, it's a like esteemed incubator for startups in San Francisco, in the Bay Area. So he's like, and then he was like, "I'm not even that interested in it." And the classic startup advice is build products that solve your own problems. And so he started like, "Well, what are my problems?" And he thought, "Hey, maybe there's something here." And so he looked around. He's like, "Oh, there's this guy who was featured in Bloomberg, and he lives here in San Francisco. I'm going to give him a call." After I asked him, like, "Hey, what are you building?" He said, "I don't know. I have this idea to build like a directory kind of marketplace, like an Airbnb for dungeon masters." And I was like, "Dude, I've been trying to build something really similar." And I told him about what I was working on and what I had envisioned in this. And he's like, "Oh my gosh." And we got so excited. We ended up talking for 6 hours on the phone that night. My wife was in the other room because we were in the small, one bedroom. And she's like, what is going on? You just took a weird random call and you've been in there forever. And the next day, Nate reached out to me. He's like, hey, would you want to be a co-founder and build this with me? I was like, absolutely. And it's funny, for the first 4 or 6 months, we had never met in person because of the lockdown. We finally ended up going to a park to celebrate after our first customer, our first real booking, and we sat in the park and we celebrated. But yeah, it's wild to think about it. It's also great, like, product or founder market fit. Like, Nate is definitely like the person who wanted this to exist because he wanted to play. And I was the person that was like, this should exist because there's so many people that want to do it. There's so many people that can become great, that are great storytellers, that, like, they should be able to. But before, it was just required so much work from a GM to do so many jobs that aren't GMing. My grandfather always had a great saying: if you're a mechanic, don't be an accountant. And it's such like, classic kind of off the cuff advice, but it is true. Like, if you spend a lot of time doing the stuff that you don't want to do, you can't get better at the stuff you do like to do.
Yeah, absolutely. And I wanted to highlight one thing that I think really, in my opinion, sort of defines what the heart of Start Playing Games is, at least for me. And that is, you initially had that thought like, hey, I'm gonna share all of these things that I have learned getting bookings with other GMs. And one of the things that I think is so foundationally important, and like what's so amazing about Start Playing Games, is that it is redefining like what the marketplace was, because prior to that, it was really a bunch of people on Patreon, or they had their own website, and they were all trying to like soak up the market as much as they could. And it was very, I guess, very antagonistic towards each other, perhaps a little bit, in that people would be looking at them stealing customers from someone else, or they would sort of have that mindset, a very red ocean strategy mindset. But Start Playing Games has always been about the blue ocean strategy for me, and like a rising tide lifts all ships.
And it's funny too, because when we did, I did tons of user interviews with players, and so many when we would show them like personal GM websites, Patreons, things like that, they didn't trust them because they were like, it's just them. Everything that you're showing here is their own. There's no social proof. And we realized really early how important that was. And then we also realized how, how many different players there are. You kind of understand that, but when you start doing these interviews, like, wow, there are just so many different play styles. And it's something I tell GMs all the time: you never try to cast the biggest net to catch the most amount of fish. You want to catch the exact fish that's right for your meal. This metaphor is breaking down. But the idea that you want to find the players that are right for you. If you get every player, there are people that aren't going to have fun in your games because your playstyle isn't right for them. There's a great, I think it was a TED Talk, but this woman talked about how if your ideology in yourself is so present in how you present yourself, you can opt out people that wouldn't be a good fit for you in your life and things like that. And what she does is she, on Tinder, she ended up changing her front photo to a shirt where she's wearing that says, "If you hurt animals, I'll hurt you." And it's like a PETA shirt. And it's because she's vegan, she's an animal rights activist, things like that. The 2 weeks after having done that, the matches she got were much more in line with her ideology versus before, where people like, "Oh, you're a vegan? Like, that's stupid." Or, things like she got less of that because people were opting out because it was so clear who she was and what she valued, that people didn't value that, just navigated away. And I thought that was really interesting, that like, and that feels very true to like any service that's similar to like what GMs are doing.
Yeah. And I have this conversation all the time during my ad copy workshops with GMs who talk to me about these problem players that they get. And I say, okay, well, send me a link to your profile. Let me take a look. And I'm like, well, your profile doesn't say anything about you. Your profile is not attracting people that would play well with you, because you're not describing like what type of table that you run. You're not describing like what your values are. And honestly, since I've always been on Start Playing with like sort of this presence that, hey, I'm openly trans. And people who are not trans get a lot more transphobia than I ever do. Like I don't think I've ever had someone join and have a problem with me being trans. I've never had that issue. I've had other issues, but like being upfront about like what is the product is very important just in sales and marketing or anything, because if you are very upfront and like, this is what the campaign is, this is what your experience is gonna be like, this is the table for you if you like this, this, and this, then you're gonna have someone who buys into it because that's what they really want. They're not just there to play any game, they want to play the special game for them.
100%. You know, that's why if you're like fantasy open sandbox game isn't gonna hit because you know, like you could get 3 different people that all want different experiences of fantasy sandbox. It comes to when I talk about content warnings. Actually, I put out a really good email that goes out to our GMs about content warnings, because I see a lot of GMs, they just list every content warning on StartPlaying. And for those that don't know, on StartPlaying you can select what content players can expect in your game. And a lot of times GM's like, well, I don't know what's going to happen because my players could do anything, so they select every content. And I always say, like, hey, you should try to pare that down to what is relevant to the story you're going to tell, and then use something like Lines and Veils or the RPG consent checklist to remove everything else, because you might have drowning on there, but you have no idea why that would come up. If you're running a political thriller, warfare, classism, terrorism, those are all things that are probably like essential to the story you're telling. So like drowning the spiders aren't. And so you don't need to list them there, because if people are like, hey, I'm actually not okay with this in their Lines and Veils or the RPG checklist, you're like, oh, cool. Well, it's not essential to the story, so that's fine. But you could be like self-opting out a lot of people because there's content being listed there that they're like, I'm actually not okay with, that you would be completely fine not including. And so intentionality is so important.
And as Devon says that, I'm realizing I should probably tidy up my content warnings for Strahd. Because
well, Strahd has a lot. It's pretty.
It's a lot, yeah.
It's Curse of Strahd.
There's a lot of stuff that I did intentionally remove, though. And I was just having this kind of conversation and going back to like being specific and being very intentional with both your business model and the way that you run tables. A lot of people, when they're new on StartPlaying, I've noticed they will try to sell to the easiest person to get in the game. They're like, I'll do a free session 0. I'll do like, you know, whatever you need. I'll make concessions. In my opinion, I don't know if you can have an opinion on this, but in my opinion, that's the worst strategy, because what you're going to get is people who think that they are, or people who are not going to value what you need as part of the business transaction. They're not going to value your table culture or the things that are important to you, because I have a bunch of GMs who constantly like talk to me about this. Like, I don't know what to do with this problem player. And I'm like, cut him. Yeah. It's that simple. Cut them.
It usually comes down to that, you know, and I often give the advice, what will help you run your best game ever? And if it's running games on Theater of the Mind instead of Roll20, then do that. You know, we have data that has showed like sentiment scores for VTTs are higher after an amazing session than before. So if you're great at that VTT, your players will have a higher sentiment of that VTT afterwards. But if you're not great, then that's one part of your game that won't be awesome. And so I always say, like, what time can you run? They're like, well, I could run in the evenings because that's most popular on the site, but I get off work at 5 and then I'd get home, I try to run at 6. I'm like, if you have a job that bleeds over and is frustrating, that'll bleed in your game. So always think about, you know, like, all the player wants to do is play the game, and everything you should do should be to run your best game ever. And if running your best game ever is running the games you like to run on the VTTs you like to run on the times that you can run, you're going to have a much better table because of that.
Absolutely. And the problem that people can run into is like, it can feel like very pressured for a business owner, a pro GM, to sort of concede some of these things. But what you end up finding is there's that resentment that builds up over time because, oh, I did this and this and this for you. When really, they don't have to be customers in your business long term, but you do. You have to be there the entire time. So you need to take care of like your mental health and your ability to run this business long term.
Yeah, 100%.
What's your number one advice for, besides attend the onboarding?
Yeah.
What's your number one advice, and like what
if you're a GM, if you're a GM listening to this and you haven't taken the onboarding, I'm going to find you. And I'm going to tell you to take the onboarding.
That's all that's going to happen. Nothing bad. Just...
Yeah. It's such a threatening tone. So I think the big thing is always know that the player's goal is to play the game. And if you could remove as much friction around that as possible and make it as clear as possible the type of games you're running, you'll do great. And it's one of those things where like we are creating an industry. Like all the GMs, all the players, and StartPlaying, we are creating a new industry, right? There was no such thing as renting people's homes when Airbnb started, right? Like, and they went a little too well. No comment, but I feel they went a little too far in the paint. That industry hadn't existed before, and neither had professional GMing. It was a cottage industry, right? And now it's becoming something that is more feasible, but it's in this growing stage. So like things are always going to be in flux. We saw a dip. We usually see a dip in the summer, but we saw a lower dip this summer than we had in previous summers, which means like it's becoming something that is more like sought after and something that's more established. So a lot of the times people are going to be like, like this isn't working. And sometimes it is either you need to make some changes or sometimes like, yep, you just need to wait it out. And it's a really rough thing right now. But that kind of sinkhole that we've seen around holidays continues to get smaller. And it's just part of like being like a pioneer in the space. I remember like, oh, we got a holiday coming up. We know we're going to see a downtick. And we're like, whoa, we actually saw an uptick in bookings, not in playing, but we saw an uptick on bookings on a holiday. And July 4th, we saw an uptick in bookings. That was a holiday. And usually you don't see an uptick in bookings. You see a downtick in bookings and less people playing because people are taking time off. But, instead of 30% of people taking games off on July 4th, it was only 10% of people taking games off on July 4th. And that was wild. That blew me away.
Yeah, that is fucking wild, actually. Considering that a majority of your demographic is North American, right? Or like United States. Yeah.
Yeah.
That is wild. Wow.
But I'm not a big fireworks guy. So maybe other people aren't either.
Yeah, fair enough. People are less patriotic. That's what it is.
Yeah. So I think at the end of the day is like if you're trying to focus on like removing friction for players, which is like making it easy for them to start, great onboarding, making your adventures clear, all that stuff. That's going to bring people to your game. That's going to make people enjoy your game, and we have the data. If people have enjoyed your game, they're going to stick around. On average, the retention rate is wild.
Yeah, and even if they don't necessarily, what I found to be interesting when you first told me this some time back was if someone joins your game, has a good experience, but can't play with you for whatever reason, they stick on the website and they may come back. And I've seen that return traffic as well. Like someone who's played with me maybe like a few months back, but they will end up coming back for some new campaign that they saw because they'll tell me like, I've been waiting for another campaign to open for you and they won't communicate that to me. I wish they had, because then I could talk them into, a game or something. But yeah. So you as a CEO, like what's your weekly routine now for like business sake? What did it evolve from? Like, what did you used to do besides everything? And what do you do now?
So look, quick clarification. I'm a Riker. Nate's Picard. Because I have the beard. So Nate's actually our CEO. I'm our COO, which is just second. I'm the XO, if you will. So what does my typical week look like? Well, let's I got calendar open. Let's see what we. So a lot of meetings. I had Monday was all meetings except for lunch. Let's see, and then same with Tuesday. And same with Wednesday. And a lot of these meetings are like meeting with publishers to get them to, to talk about an event we had with them, or to talk about doing another event. I just had a meeting yesterday with Renegade Studios, and they're excited to start doing monthly events with StartPlaying. And that meeting was like, hey, here's how it did. Here's how you rank up against other events. It looked pretty well. I think you have a good opportunity. Like, well, we also want to do this. I'm like, cool, we can make that happen. And then I have a handful of meetings with influencers who are creating content for us. So a lot of like TikTok and YouTube influencers, we will use their content in our performance marketing. And they'll kind of create content and then we'll reuse that. So I would probably say like at least 2 to 3 hours of my day are spent in either Facebook or Google Ads, Facebook ads or Google Ads, or one of the many ad platforms we're in, and just tweaking things, seeing where like spend is dripping, or where scale is available. And so it's like, oh, this ad set's just pumping. Let's like continue to crush into that. And there's a lot of stuff I learned at Chubby's, and then just kind of like for those that don't know, Chubby's is like vintage inspired resort wear, like shorts your dad used to wear. And so a lot of my experience there, and that's why like a lot of the terminology, like we're crushing it, is because it came from that dude bro culture, but which was great. Like the Chubby's taught me so much about e-commerce and product and performance marketing and content marketing. Like and it was really funny because it was this dude bro brand, right? But when I got there, almost more than half of the team were women. But you wouldn't know from the brand because it was a menswear brand. Right. But I learned so much from that team. And then I meet with some VTTs, and that's kind of this past week. I wrote a job posting this past week, and then I spent 10 hours writing questions and building out a pipeline, stuff like that. So that's kind of what this week had looked like so far. And then I had obviously this podcast. But I would say, like, when you're at this early stage of a startup, you have a lot of IC work and a lot of leadership work, and it's kind of a balance between the two. IC work is individual contributor work. That's me, making sure our performance marketing is jamming, making sure that it's effective and spent. And then there's the kind of leadership work where it's like, hey, we need to like train up the team. And like, hey, how's this interview process going to go? How's this going to go? Who can I delegate what to? And then so it's kind of a mix of those two things. Let's see. And then every Friday, the entire leadership team of StartPlaying, we get together, we kind of like digest everything, see what we need help from each other, and then talk about like big stuff. We also did like a really great brainstorm this week on some new products that we're going to be launching this quarter and next. Now that we have our new product designer, Nick, we have this thing called an MOC, which is mission, objectives, and competencies. And when you get hired, we got to make your mission is this as your role. And then we have some objectives you need to complete to prove out your competencies in the first 30, 60, 90 days. And that's to make sure like, cool, we made the right hire. You're going to be great. We can entrust you. You can work autonomous, all of these things. And so that's usually what happens in the first like 90 days of joining StartPlaying is you're working on these projects or these things to confirm that you can hit objectives and you have these competencies. Nick, our new product designer, has been working on that. And now that is finished, we can like literally start running with new product. And a lot of the stuff that like people have clamored for, things that we really want to do as a team, are now viable things to do because we have a product designer. For those that know, product designers are like, hey, how is the flow? If we need to make it easy for a person to do X, Y, and Z, how is the site set up for that? Because a lot of the times people say, well, just put a button here. It's like, well, if you do that, then it breaks this, which breaks this. And then there's so much thought that needs to come in it and so much research. So now that we have him on our team and he's ready to like, start building a lot, I'm excited for what comes next. And I spend around 20 to 30% of my week building out product specs for growth engine projects. So, I mean, I guess I could kind of tell you about a sneaky one. I guess I could. Yeah, I guess I could share. So, Nate kind of oversees core product, and core product is like scheduling, calendar, how the site, like the core features. A lot of my time is spent either in customer features or in growth features. And growth is like what can help us drive more players on the site. One of the things I've been working on is a quiz to results, where a player lands on a page and it starts asking you questions, and then it sends you into a results page to kind of get you the best fit for the game. So like, when can you play? Cool. And then it's like, okay, well, if you come and play these, okay, what kind of game are you looking for? Are you looking, and we're going to test it out with a bunch of stuff, but are you looking for a superhero game, a horror game, a high fantasy game? Okay, awesome. You're looking for this. Are you looking for D&D? Are you looking for an indie game? Are you looking for everything? Okay, cool. You're looking for an indie game. Great. And essentially, there's this kind of psychology in purchasing online, where if you have a user make a number of small steps, they have a higher confidence in the results that they get from that. That's why filters are so popular, right? So having people make these small steps will give them a higher confidence than if they just did it, if they just browsed. And people are always looking for confidence, right? And they're like, okay, this is the games that are great for me. So giving them out like 10 games that might be a perfect fit for what they're looking for based off of the quiz.
How can you speak to what's the percentage of people using filters to look for a game?
Pretty high. I don't know off the top of my head, but I remember we looked at it at our offsite and we were like, oh yeah, there's a lot of people. And we actually have a filters change coming out pretty soon. Let's see. I wonder if it's out now. Nope, not yet. Inspect. Yeah, it should be launching probably this week, maybe next. But when if you're listening to this, it's been out for a while already. But we're making a change to mobile filters, and then hopefully we're following up fast with a time filter that gives more exact time filtering.
Yeah. What do you think about, I don't know if you're allowed to answer this, but what do you think about the individuals who post games at like the 59th minute and stuff like that? Is that something that's going to be eliminated in the future? Are we only doing 30 minutes or 15-minute increments?
I think with exact time, I don't think they'll have that advantage. Because I think the problem right now is you can only search in time blocks. And I think when people can now, like, I want to find games at 7 p.m. And players are going to kind of like drive that decision. And I think that kind of like odd tooling of search and that use case just won't be relevant because people can search for exact time. Like I want to look for games that start between 6 and 7. And if your game starts at 6:59, that's fine, right? But if someone's like, I want games that are 7 and on, like you will obviously no longer be, considered inside of that.
Yeah.
And so I think it's one of those things like solve the problem, not the cause, right? But the problem is people can't select exact time, and then people are just trying to get in front of as many games as possible. But the problem for the player is I need to find an exact time. And some GMs are like, oh, I'm going to do this so I show up more. And the problem we want to solve is making it easy for the player. Yeah. Because if you make it easy for the player, they're going to book, and then that's great for the GM.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, that's a great answer. Solve the problem, not the not the symptom. That makes sense. As far as you moving on to 2024, what's the future of SPG? Right now, you're at 10 people, right? 10 people.
Yeah.
What's the future for 2024?
So by the end of this year, we'll definitely have like locked down our growth engine. And what that means is we know exactly where we can grow with as many users as possible. Right now, we have a number of growth engines, and we're just trying to figure out which one is the most efficient and which one will provide the most amount of players to our GMs. That's a big one. We're growing steadily, but we're gonna go to some quick, big jumps of growth, probably over the next 6 months, and that's gonna be really exciting. That's gonna bring a lot of players to the platform. I think what you're gonna see is a lot of personalization is probably going to be a big thing and a lot more options. And then I think the 2024 is when we're going to start laying the groundwork for like internationalization, kids games and in-person games. That's what I hope. We're probably going to do, a lot of other products in between now and then, but it's really funny, like how fast our engineering team is now that we've kind of grown it, that the amount of product we can put out is much faster now, and the time from inception to release is much shorter. So I think that's going to be it's going to be really surprising when people, once that clicks, that we're like, oh wow, there's like something new coming out every week. Because when we started, it was like that. But then when you get to a certain size, your infrastructure won't allow you to do that because everything you're releasing touches so many things that you have to do so much more QA. You have to make so many more changes across the site. But now with a larger engineering team, it's so much faster.
Yeah, that makes sense. And then you can build momentum, and then you've got people solving problems ideally quicker if they're working together, right? Yeah, that's incredible. For you looking back, and you don't necessarily have to tell on yourself, but what are some of the mistakes that StartPlaying made throughout its first couple of years?
I would say one of the biggest ones is we were focusing on groups. our original product was you book a GM with your group. So it's like, hey, I got me and 3 friends. We can all play at this time. We'll play as GM. And we just saw that break down, like, be like, oh, actually, the schedule doesn't work for so-and-so anymore. And the GM's like, that doesn't work for me. And we realized the scheduling part is like trying to schedule a group that you already have doesn't work. You have to say, this is when I can work. If it can work for you, you can join me. But when we rolled out what we originally called slotted sessions, which was you book a single seat in a game, it was like an on and off switch. Like when we started that, literally within the first week or second week, we started getting bookings, and we're like, whoa, we got 20 bookings this week. This is amazing. Now like, we'll see like 20 in an hour, right? Yeah, probably not even that, probably even more than that. But it was wild to see that happen. And it was because we made one change, because we started like doing more user interviews, and we just realized like, oh, it's not the people's in their schedule was the problem. That was the root that we needed to solve. And we realized more people than we thought were okay with playing with strangers. And so we made that change. Everything just took off. So that was probably one of the early mistakes. I think the other mistake is, when you first start out, you don't have as much process. And we've built like this really fantastic hiring process. Shireen helped with a lot of it as well. Like she brought in this book called Who, which honestly, I wish we had read before our very early hires. We made some early hires that were good, but they weren't great. And because we didn't have a good hiring process, and that was our fault. And we didn't know how to like make it so people could succeed within their first 30, 60, 90 days. And because we did that, like it took us longer to ramp up on a lot of stuff. But if anyone's out there trying to, looking to hire people, I would definitely recommend reading this book. It's completely changed my outlook on how people are hired, and how like you create like an equitable hiring process. It is fantastic. It's one of my favorite business books.
By Jeff Smart and Randy Street.
Yeah, that sounds right.
Got the word "who" on it and a little person in the O. Solve your number one problem.
Who hiring book.
It's Who hiring.
Yep. Oh no, I had just Googled Who hiring to like see the name of the book, and like obviously that gave me like terrible results.
Gotcha. Okay, so another question I wanted to ask you, and feel free to say no about this, but can you speak? So there's a fundamental, I think, misunderstanding of what StartPlaying is sometimes with some individuals who are more expecting, like, I'm sure you've seen some of those, let's call them competitors for now, out there who are more boutique D&D booking services where they have people on staff that are heavily vetted, where I see StartPlaying games more as like the marketplace, right? Can you speak to those key differences, and why did you intentionally do that?
We wanted to solve the problem, not provide a solution. So in that sense, if you were boutique, you were providing a solution to some people. But solving the problem is like, it's hard to find a D&D game. It's not easy. It doesn't always work out. And like, you don't know what you're getting yourself into. Like all these things are preventing people from having the amazing community that Tabletop provides. Our mission at the end of the day is to build communities through play. That is what brings us joy. And the stories I've heard about the communities that have been built is fantastic. So there's also a scale aspect too. If we wanted to do it for 30 people, we could, but it wouldn't require the infrastructure we've built, and it wouldn't allow us to make it as easy as possible for as many people as possible to find their communities and play these games. So that's why we didn't kind of explore the boutique route. Like, we want to solve the problem, for anyone who wants to play games. And it's a lot harder to do that with something that's kind of boutique. And so the scale of what we're looking to do and to solve it for every person is kind of like one of the big differentiators.
Probably one of the things that is coming up recently, at least, is as SPG is growing in popularity and notoriety, there are more and more negative press pieces or like negative social media posts about StartPlaying games, because ultimately, and unfortunately perhaps, StartPlaying games sort of bears the burden of their best and their worst. GMs wise. So
absolutely.
What is StartPlaying Games doing with the lessons learned thus far with the service to eliminate those bad cases?
Yeah, it's so true too, because like I've lived in a bubble with my games where I've never had these kind of same experiences. But what's always funny is a lot of people always ask, am I getting a lot of entitled players expecting me to give them a Vorpal sword because they're paying for the game? And it's funny because like that is such a rare case where that kind of like player exists. And the big thing is like we've created a lot of new policy around things because it's the first time it's happened to us. So, I think I saw, like there was a Reddit post about someone who had a really bad experience with the GM, and when that finally came to us, we took our steps and we like let the GM know like what's acceptable, what isn't acceptable, and we do the same thing with players. Sometimes players will come in too hot about someone with the GM, and we'll be like, hey, we need to investigate this. It's like, why would you investigate that? I just told you. I'm like, well, okay, listen, we have to make sure that like we're keeping everyone safe, and that's why we like put so much work into like actually investigating these tickets and then taking the steps needed. And sometimes that results in a strike, and we'll get a GM that's like, you know what, you're right, I fucked up. Thank you, I appreciate it. And that's probably 90% of the time, to maybe even more, what we see GMs do. They take accountability, and the same thing with players. We see players take accountability for messing up. That 5 to 10% of the time when they don't and they kind of double down, that's just another sign to us like, okay, you don't want to learn from this, you don't want to grow from this. And depending on like their reaction, that could also result in a ban. And I think building out new policy as stuff happens is how we're going to be able to scale and deal with these problems as they do. But when people say, well, why didn't you have a policy that begin with? It's like, because it's never happened. Like it's hard. You can never try to plan for everything because new things will always happen. You'll always have to figure out like, how are we going to handle this? But having a very comprehensive code of conduct helps a lot. Having a very thorough terms of service helps a lot. So those are probably like the big things that I've learned is that you won't have the answer for everything. You'll have to investigate, you'll have to learn, and you'll have to create something around this because, again, all the GMs, all the players, us, we're all pioneers into a new industry. And so making sure that like we're like top of mind, keeping our community safe is like the guiding light in a lot of this decision making.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think one of the difficulties that I've never so I've had, of course, everyone just as you and some of the team perhaps like when I got my strike, which you're not a real pro GM until you get a strike, in my opinion. But I'm just kidding. Don't do that. But the difficulty is that you have such a broad range of different styles of games that it's very difficult because to enact policy in a proper way because you have someone who absolutely wants like the most vile things as part of their like play experience, which would absolutely be a barrier to a different type of player, right? Or a different type of community. So yeah, I think it's a very difficult issue.
Yeah, and agreed. And the thing is, nothing worth doing is easy, right? A lot of people say like, well, how would you do this? How he's like, we're gonna have to figure it out. There's a lot of stuff that you can kind of plan for and that you can kind of spec out. And we did a lot of that. And then, new things happen and we've kind of built off of that. So that's why our code of conduct is like, a living document. Like it was always changing, always being added to because of that. There's so much that is unknown because this is brand new.
And let's just hit some numbers real quick. You recently hit how many millions of dollars earned on the website?
GMs have earned over $13 million running games on StartPlaying.
13 million. How many users do you have right now that are active on a monthly basis?
I think it's somewhere upwards of 40 to 50,000 monthly players and GMs.
So they're really... I wonder, like, that are booking, though. Is that's what I'm very curious about. Because I wonder what's the ratio? That's always the question. Like, when people are like, is the market saturated or not? But I don't know if that's something that you would want to share at this point in time.
Yeah. Is the market here's the thing. I think it's saturated and not saturated. Saturated and not saturated. I think a lot of people they'll want to GM, and they're like, I got to do a little more extra work. And then they're like, no, I don't want to do this. And other people are like, oh, this is exactly what I want. I want to run one game a week. And then someone else is like, I want to run 7 games a week. I want to be full time. And I think it is this kind of balancing act where like tons of players come, and then there's enough GMs or not enough GMs, and then there's more GMs. Because every time we have a big player push, we see more GMs show up as well. And not every GM takes the onboarding, and the GMs that don't take the onboarding usually don't succeed.
Yeah.
Uh, it is just one of those wild things where, because you'll make a few small errors early on that then put you so much further back, and you end up with a negative review because of something that you didn't read, you didn't see the warning about, things like that, and then it's kind of a bummer, and maybe you lose your steam, and that's why we like push the onboarding so much, because we want people to see. That's why I do it. Is I want people to get exactly what they want out of start playing.
Absolutely. And I think one of the things that most people have a misconception about is, and I was talking about this with one of your old time users, one of your old time GMs, Eric V, about this was
Oh
like back
yeah,
in, yeah, Eric V, and back in 2020, 2021, a lot of the GMs, because there was such an influx of players as opposed to how many GMs were on the website, they didn't have to do a lot for their advertising, their personal ad, because it was just easier to fill games. You could just post games. And now what we've seen since 2022 is that it is much more competitive with your ads.
yeah. I think that's the case of. I have a theory, and I don't have a lot to base this off of, but I think players graduate into games, and they also graduate into price points. And I think there's more GMs that are graduating into those price points than the rate of players are, and so I think you're seeing like kind of like this balance that needs to happen, where enough players graduate to that. And what I've noticed is the longer people play on the platform, they usually end up graduating to a higher price point. So I think that's kind of where one of those balancing issues comes from. And I do think it's just solved by more players. Like the more players you have, the better that kind of balances out with gyms that kind of been established for a long time and kind of have a higher price point.
I think that's absolutely true. It's very rare for me to get a player who is brand new to the website because I'm at that $35, $40 price point. And most people enter at the median, they enter at like 20, 25. And that
because
does
it's so
make
new
sense.
to them, right? They're like,
Yeah.
I don't know, like, and once they're like, oh, this is totally worth paying money for, then they kind of like realize that, and they kind of graduate like, oh, I'm happy to pay this because it's so important to me, and like I love what I'm getting out of this.
Yeah, absolutely. That makes total sense. And yeah, I think some people, some GMs perhaps, I don't want to say raise their prices too quickly, but I think any raise in the price really has to be balanced with the amount of value that you're bringing to your tables. Because if you're not creating a very
Yeah,
unique and special experience, then you can't even think about raising your prices
yeah.
past the median, in my opinion, because they can get that anywhere else if you're just going for an
Exactly.
average experience. Yeah.
There's a great. I actually gave this feedback to a GM the other day. They were doing $30. They had just started. They were brand new. Then I was like, hey, if you're trying to make this much per hour, as a new GM, what I would suggest is moving down to 2 to 3 hour session, which you're going to make the same amount if you charge $5 less. And I think you're going to be more successful out the gate rather than trying to run these longer games at this higher rate. Because if you've priced this because you need to make a certain amount an hour, then think about like how many hours you're running games. And I see that a lot too. So it's like, I'm going to run a $15 game for a 4 hour, $15 game. Like, ooh, try like a 2 to 3 hour game. Because you're going to save yourself that extra hour. And a lot of people that I think that are paying to play are not looking for very long, hour games. I think, and this again is anecdotal. This is just like a theory I have. I haven't, so you don't have to act on it. But I think a lot of people are like, hey, I have the disposable income to play for a game, but I don't have the disposable time to dedicate so much. And so I think 2 to 3 hours is the most popular amount of time booked on the site. More people book 2 to 3 hours than 3 to 4. And I think that has something to do with like people's time and their availability.
Yeah, absolutely. And honestly, I think it's one of the things that really separates casual tables from pro GM tables is that a lot of these GMs are coming in and they are offering that like, hey, we show up, we BS for like 10 minutes, then we get to it and it's like you're getting the same amount of quote unquote content, you're getting the same amount of
Yeah,
gameplay as you would at a 4 or 5 hour sessions because you're not in an informal setting. You're in a setting
yeah.
where it's like you're getting the maximum amount. It's like been highly edited down to really produce like the most bang out of your buck. And I know I deviate from that business model because that's like my community and stuff where I like my gossip times are atrocious. Like we have a 30 to 60 minute gossip time for every one of my games,
Yeah.
which is not everybody's cup of tea, but like it works for me and I don't recommend it if you're new. Um, but yeah. Was there anything else that you wanted to touch on about Start Playing Games or discuss before we close out here, Devon?
No, I mean, you will start playing like again, like all of our onboardings, all of our stuff is all like designed to like because we want to see people succeed. Like it brings us so much joy when I read that success channel every day and hear the new things that are happening with folks. So that's really really rewarding. Also, I should get you. I should send you one. Ping me your address after this. When I talked about like all the things that I have made that I want for myself have become very successful. Like the games I've created in actual plays, even start playing. It's something I wanted to exist. And it's one of those things that's funny because we at Total Party Chill we started making merch. And one of the things is our player mat, which is it's like a mouse pad, like a giant 31-inch wide mouse pad, but it has all of the D&D player rules on it, like conditions, cover, spellcasting, combat, and it's one of the most popular products we've ever made. And it was weird because I made them for my table. And I just asked me like, hey, would you guys want to buy these if I sold them? And everyone flipped out and it went viral on TikTok. And now it's just one of like the standard things that like we sell that, people love. And it's just like, it's one of those things like I wanted this. And so if you're out there thinking about the things that you want to do and the things that bring you joy, start with those rather than things that you think are the most marketable, because the things that you like will probably be more successful than the things that are just marketable.
And damn, that's beautiful. That's such great advice. And it really speaks to the practicality and the sort of like business sense that I wish more pro GMs would like sort of dip their toes into more of this business conversation because you are running a business. And one of the reasons why I was so successful in my first year is because I doubled down on what was working for me and what I wanted to see being run on the website. So absolutely. Thank you so much for coming on, Devon. This has been wonderful.
Thanks for having me, Friday. Appreciate it.
Hi, thanks for listening. If you want to support me, you can find me on Patreon at patreon.com/isfriday, or you can find some of the work that I'm doing at vineyardrpg.com if you want to pre-order the book that we made. Thanks.